For years, the internet treated Chuck Norris like a man who could never die. Not age, not time, not even truth itself. His name stopped being just a celebrity name a long time ago. It became a myth, a joke, a symbol of impossible strength. Millions laughed at the meme that said, "Chuck Norris never dies." And that was exactly why the real ending felt so unreal. Because behind the legend, behind the beard, the boots, the silence, and that unshakable screen presence, there was always a man. A very real man. One who came from poverty, rejection, and pain long before he ever became one of the toughest icons Hollywood had ever sold to the world. Before the fame, he was Carlos Ray Norris. Before the movies, before the television empire, before Walker, a Texas Ranger, turned him into a household name. He was a shy boy from Oklahoma growing up in a broken home. He was not born looking invincible. He became that image piece by piece, through discipline, rage, humiliation, and relentless self-reinvention. And maybe that is why the public had such a hard time accepting the truth when his final chapter arrived. Because men like Chuck Norris are not supposed to fade. They are supposed to outlive the headlines, outlast the culture, stand taller than age itself. But real life does not care about mythology. In March 2026, that mythology collided with reality. Reports confirmed that Chuck Norris had passed away at the age of 86, surrounded by family in Hawaii. The family shared the news quietly. No grand spectacle, no theatrical public unraveling, just a final truth delivered with dignity. And almost immediately, the world responded the way it always had with Chuck Norris. First with disbelief, then with nostalgia, and finally with the uneasy realization that an era had truly ended. What makes his story more haunting is that rumors about his death had surfaced many times over the years. False reports, internet hoaxes, recycled gossip, none of it seemed able to touch him. In a strange way, the endless rumors only strengthened the myth. Every false alarm made him look more immortal. Every comeback fed the image that Chuck Norris existed above the ordinary rules of time. So, when the day finally came that the news was real, many people reacted as if reality itself had made a mistake. But the truth is more complicated, and far more human. Chuck Norris did not become a legend because he was superhuman. He became a legend because he understood something deeper than fame. Image is power, discipline is power, and endurance is sometimes the only revenge life leaves you. He built that power with his body first. In the Air Force, stationed in Korea, he began studying martial arts. That decision changed everything. It gave structure to a life that had once been defined by insecurity. It gave him identity. Then it gave him victories, titles, respect, students. Eventually, it gave him entry into rooms Hollywood would never have opened for the young, uncertain man he once was. But here is where the public story often gets it wrong. Chuck Norris was never just a movie tough guy. Long before the cameras fully embraced him, he had already built a reputation in the martial arts world. He trained celebrities. He earned the attention of powerful people. He stood across from Bruce Lee on screen and somehow did not disappear in the shadow of one of the most magnetic figures in cinema history. That alone tells you something about the force Chuck Norris carried. He was not flashy. He was not elegant. He was granite. And yet the real mystery of Chuck Norris was never his punch. It was his control, his stillness, his restraint, his refusal to explain too much. Even at the height of fame, he projected something old-fashioned and almost severe. While Hollywood changed around him, becoming louder, messier, more ironic, Chuck Norris remained solid, stern, and strangely untouched. That made him look outdated to some people. To others, it made him feel eternal. And that is exactly why his final years matter. Because they reveal what legends look like after the applause fades. Not when they are at their strongest, but when they are carrying age, private battles, family burdens, and the weight of being remembered more as a symbol than as a person. And once you see that part of the story, Chuck Norris no longer looks like an untouchable action hero. He looks like something rarer, a man who spent his life becoming iron, only to discover that even iron bends in the end. But if you really want to understand what happened to Chuck Norris, you have to look past the memes, past the movie posters, and past the myth that made him seem indestructible. Because the hardest battles of his life were not always fought in public. For decades, Chuck Norris represented a very specific kind of American masculinity. Controlled, tough, moral, quietly dominant. On screen, he was the man who walked into chaos and restored order with his fists, his code, and his unshakable sense of right and wrong. Audiences trusted that image because he rarely betrayed it. He did not build fame on scandal. He did not live like a man desperate for attention. And in an industry addicted to reinvention, Chuck Norris stayed almost unnervingly the same. That consistency became part of his power. But consistency can also become a trap, because when the whole world sees you as a symbol of strength, very few people stop to ask what strength is costing you behind closed doors. By the time he entered his later years, Chuck Norris was no longer just an actor or martial arts legend. He was a cultural relic, a living icon, and eventually something stranger than both. A man turned into folklore while he was still alive. The internet did not just remember him, it transformed him. Chuck Norris jokes made him less like a person and more like an immortal force of nature. At first, that kind of pop culture afterlife looked flattering. It kept his name alive for a younger generation that may never have seen a single episode of Walker, Texas Ranger. But there was also something eerie about it. The joke worked because it erased vulnerability. It erased age. It erased illness. It erased decline. It erased the possibility that Chuck Norris, like everyone else, was moving toward an ending. And real life was moving all the same. As he grew older, his world became more private. The red carpets mattered less. The noise of Hollywood mattered less. The priorities shifted. Public image gives way to family. Celebrity gives way to survival. And for Chuck Norris, one of the most defining chapters of his later life was not about reviving his career. It was about protecting the people he loved, especially when health crises began to cast long shadows over the life he had built. That is the part many casual fans never understood. A man can look invincible in the public imagination and still spend his private life carrying fear that no audience ever sees. He had already spent years proving his toughness to the world. He no longer needed to prove he could fight. The real question was, what happens when a man who built his identity around strength is forced into a stage of life where strength looks different, less cinematic, less glamorous, more patient, more painful, more silent? This is where the Chuck Norris story becomes something far more serious than nostalgia. Because aging is brutal for action legends. The world remembers them frozen in their prime, fast, hard, unbeatable. It does not easily accept their humanity. Wrinkles feel like betrayal. Frailty feels like sacrilege. Every changed appearance becomes a headline. Every absence becomes a rumor. And for someone like Chuck Norris, whose public identity had been inflated into near supernatural status, even ordinary aging invited speculation. That is why death rumors followed him for years. Not only because the internet feeds on misinformation, but because the myth had become too large for reality. People had turned Chuck Norris into an idea that felt incompatible with mortality. So false reports spread again and again, each one tapping into the same cultural fascination. Could a man like this ever really disappear? But in the end, the more meaningful question was never whether Chuck Norris could die. It was whether the world ever truly allowed him to live as an ordinary man. To be tired, to be old, to be private, to step away without being treated like a fallen monument. That tension followed him into his final years. The less he appeared, the more the mythology rushed in to fill the silence. Some took his absence as mystery. Others treated it as proof of secret decline. And that is often what fame becomes in old age, a hall of mirrors where the public keeps projecting stories onto a person who may simply be trying to live quietly. And yet, even in that silence, Chuck Norris remained valuable as a brand. That is another uncomfortable truth. Legends do not only leave behind memories, they leave behind markets. His name carried financial weight. Decades of film, television, endorsements, books, martial arts branding, and cultural recognition turned Chuck Norris into more than a star. He became an asset, a symbol with commercial gravity. By the later stage of his life, conversations about him increasingly included not just who he was, but what he was worth. Net worth estimates, property speculation, licensing talk, and legacy value. These are the cold calculations that begin circling public figures as they age. And there is something deeply sad about that. Because once the world starts measuring your final chapter in dollars, it becomes easier to forget the man at the center of it. The boy from Oklahoma, the insecure kid from a broken home, the serviceman searching for purpose, the fighter building himself from discipline, the husband, the father, the aging man trying to hold on to dignity while the world insists on remembering only his myth. That is why Chuck Norris's story still hits so hard. Not because he was flawless, not because he was superhuman, not because the memes made him immortal, but because his life exposed the gap between image and truth. He gave the world strength. The world gave him legend. But legend is a lonely thing to carry when your body begins to slow and your life becomes smaller, quieter, more fragile. And in that silence, the man behind the myth finally becomes visible, not as a joke, not as an action hero, but as something much more haunting, a symbol of power who could defeat almost everything except time. To understand why Chuck Norris became so much bigger than the average celebrity, you have to go back to the years when America did not just admire strong men on screen. It needed them. And Chuck Norris arrived at exactly the right time. He was not polished like the classic movie stars. He did not have the effortless swagger of a born Hollywood insider. He was stiffer than some actors, quieter than others, and never especially interested in charming the room in the conventional way. But that became his advantage. He felt less like a performer, and more like a man who had wandered in from the real world, a man who had actually been hit, actually suffered, actually learned discipline the hard way. That authenticity made him different. In an era when action heroes were becoming larger, louder, and more exaggerated, Chuck Norris brought something else: certainty. He did not play men who doubted themselves for very long. He played men who endured, men who held the line, men who believed that disorder could still be beaten back by courage, skill, and moral clarity. That made him deeply appealing to audiences who were tired of irony and chaos. He represented order. He represented control. He represented the fantasy that one strong man with principles could still make the world make sense. And nowhere was that fantasy more powerful than Walker, Texas Ranger. That show did more than make Chuck Norris famous. It transformed him into a weekly ritual of justice. As Cordell Walker, he was no longer just an actor appearing in an action role. He became a symbol of old-school righteousness, a protector figure for millions of viewers who saw in him a version of masculinity that felt increasingly rare. He did not just win fights. He defended a moral universe. Good and evil were still legible in that world, and Chuck Norris stood squarely on the side of what was right. That matters more than critics like to admit. Because critics often focused on the show's simplicity, its sentimentality, even its stiffness. But audiences were not watching Walker, Texas Ranger for complexity. They were watching for reassurance. They were watching because Chuck Norris made them believe that decency did not have to be weak, that honor did not have to be naive, that strength and virtue could still live in the same body. And for years, that image held. But the burden of that image was enormous. The public tends to confuse a role with a person, especially when the role fits so neatly with the myth already forming around the actor. Chuck Norris was not just playing the strong, stoic protector anymore. He was becoming trapped inside that expectation. The fans wanted the same man everywhere, in interviews, in public appearances, in politics, in private life, even in old age. They did not merely admire the image, they depended on it. That is one of the darkest bargains of fame. The more a public figure means to people, the less freedom he has to become anything else. So while Chuck Norris's career brought him wealth, status, and a level of recognition most actors never reach, it also froze him in a very specific form. He became the face of toughness itself. Eventually, even people who had never seen his films knew his name, but they did not know him. They knew the version of him that culture had mass-produced. The unbeatable man, the unaging force, the punchline that somehow doubled as a compliment. And beneath all of that, life kept unfolding in ways far less theatrical. There was marriage, fatherhood, responsibility, the slow shift from ambition to stewardship, the understanding that legacy is not just what strangers say about you, but what your family lives with after the noise fades. For all the public fascination with Chuck Norris's power, his later life suggests a man increasingly drawn away from spectacle and toward privacy. That is often what happens when someone has spent decades being watched. Visibility starts to feel like exhaustion. Attention starts to feel like theft. So he withdrew, not dramatically, not bitterly, just gradually. That withdrawal, however, had consequences in the age of the internet. Silence online is never interpreted as silence. It is interpreted as mystery, trouble, collapse, conspiracy, or decline. And for a man whose legend had been inflated into something almost supernatural, every quiet season became fertile ground for rumors. Where was he? Why had he disappeared? Was he sick? Was he dying? Had something happened behind closed doors? The less he said, the more the public invented. That is how modern celebrity works. It does not tolerate empty space. If a famous person does not narrate their own life constantly, strangers will do it for them. And Chuck Norris, whether by temperament or by principle, never seemed interested in turning his private existence into a running public performance. That choice may have preserved his dignity, but it also made him strangely vulnerable to myth. People filled the gaps with fantasy because the real man remained out of reach. There is something tragic in that. A man spends his whole life building discipline, character, and self-control, only to be flattened at the end into headlines, rumors, memes, and net worth estimates. That is why the story of Chuck Norris cannot just be told as a celebration of toughness. It also has to be told as a warning about what happens when fame hardens a human being into an icon. Icons are admired, but they are also simplified. They are stripped of contradiction, and once that happens, their suffering becomes harder for the public to perceive. That was the paradox of Chuck Norris. The stronger the image became, the easier it was for the world to miss the human being inside it. He had spent a lifetime mastering combat, discipline, and endurance. But some battles do not care how strong you once were. Age does not negotiate. Time does not respect legacy. The body does not remain loyal forever. And no amount of cultural mythology can protect a man from the simple, final fact that every legend is still made of flesh. That is what makes his story linger. Because beneath the jokes, beneath the television heroics, beneath the mythology of invincibility, there was always a deeper truth waiting to surface. Chuck Norris was never powerful because he could not fall. He was powerful because he built a life convincing the world he never would. And when the end finally came, that illusion shattered in the most human way possible. Not with a dramatic collapse, not with scandal, not with a public breakdown, but with silence, family, and the quiet closing of a life that had once looked too strong to ever truly end. And this is where the Chuck Norris story becomes more unsettling than inspirational. Because once the rumors stop being rumors, the myth has nowhere left to hide. For years, the internet had rehearsed his death as if it were a game. False reports came and went, hoaxes spread. Headlines appeared, vanished, and returned again. Each time, the outcome was the same. Chuck Norris was still here, still standing, still somehow larger than the panic surrounding his name. That pattern did something dangerous to the public imagination. It taught people to treat his mortality like a punchline. So when the real news arrived in March 2026, many did not respond with grief at first. They responded with disbelief. Not because death is shocking, but because Chuck Norris had spent decades being framed as the exception to every rule, even the final one. His family said he died on the 19th of March, 2026, at age 86, surrounded by loved ones, and described his passing as peaceful while keeping the exact circumstances private. Major outlets, including AP and Reuters, reported the same basic account. That detail matters more than people realize. He did not go out in the way pop culture trains us to expect from icons. There was no theatrical scandal, no public medical spectacle, no final interview engineered for tears, no carefully staged goodbye tour, just a quiet ending, handled by family with dignity intact. In a media landscape that monetizes every decline, that kind of silence feels almost radical, and maybe that is why it hits so hard. Because Chuck Norris spent a lifetime being consumed by the public as an image of force. Yet the end of his life was shaped not by force, but by something much more intimate. Privacy, family, and the small sacred circle that fame can never fully own. That stands in direct conflict with the character the world projected onto him. The Chuck Norris people loved was indestructible. The Chuck Norris who actually died was human, old, mortal, finite. And for many fans, that collision between image and reality was the real heartbreak. It forced people to confront something they had spent years joking away. The man behind the myth had been aging the whole time. In fact, one of the eeriest details surrounding his death is that just days earlier, he still projected vitality publicly. People magazine reported that in his final Instagram post, shared on March 10 for his birthday, he joked, "I don't age, I level up." 9 days later, he was gone. That line now feels almost unbearable, not because it was false, but because it perfectly captured the strange contract he had with the public. Even at the end, Chuck Norris was expected to perform strength, to reassure, to joke, to stand tall inside the character everyone had built around him. And in a way, he did. But death has a brutal way of stripping performance down to truth. Once the headlines shifted from rumor to confirmation, another kind of conversation began almost immediately. Not just what he meant, but what he left behind. Legacy, estate, brand value, net worth. Those cold, familiar words that start circling public figures the moment their lives become historical instead of immediate. Most recent reporting places Chuck Norris's net worth around $70 million, built across films, television, producing, publishing, endorsements, and martial arts-related business ventures. That figure is still an estimate, not a family disclosure, but it has become the widely cited number in posthumous coverage. And this is where the sadness deepens. Because a fortune can measure success, but it cannot measure cost. It cannot measure the pressure of being a symbol for half a century. It cannot measure what it means to be mythologized while still alive. It cannot measure the exhaustion of being remembered more as an idea than as a person. By the end, Chuck Norris was worth millions, but the reason he endured was never just money. It was cultural permanence. He had crossed into that rare territory where his name no longer required explanation. Children who never watched his movies knew the myth. Adults who never trained in martial arts still associated him with discipline, force, and invincibility. He had become one of those figures America uses to tell itself stories about strength. That is a heavy inheritance, not only for the man carrying it, but for the family left behind after the applause ends. Because families do not inherit the myth, they inherit the silence after it. They inherit the absence at the table. They inherit the phone that no longer rings, the room that no longer moves, the rituals that no longer include the person everyone else is publicly grieving. And that is where the Chuck Norris story stops being about celebrity. It becomes about something much older and sadder. A son who came from hardship, a man who built himself through discipline, a husband and father who, in the end, did not belong to the public nearly as much as the public believed he did. America wanted Chuck Norris to stay frozen forever, strong, upright, morally certain, physically untouchable. But no country, no fan base, no meme, and no legend can stop the body from completing its work. Time always collects its debt. It just waited longer, and more dramatically in his case. That is why his death felt like more than the passing of an actor. It felt like the closing of a national fantasy. The fantasy that some men are simply too tough to fade, too iconic to weaken, too legendary to die quietly. But he did die quietly. And perhaps that was the most honest ending possible. Because beneath all the jokes, all the tough guy mythology, all the television justice and cinematic violence, Chuck Norris's final chapter revealed the one truth his legend could never defeat. He was not extraordinary because he escaped mortality. He was extraordinary because, for decades, he made the world forget it was waiting for him too. And maybe that is the final irony of Chuck Norris. The world spent decades pretending he could never die. But what made him unforgettable was never that fantasy. It was the opposite. It was the fact that beneath the legend, there was a man who kept choosing discipline over collapse, privacy over spectacle, and endurance over self-pity. His death, on the 19th of March 2026, closed the life of a real person, not just a meme, and the broad public record that followed was strikingly consistent. He died peacefully in Hawaii, surrounded by loved ones, with the cause kept private. Recent coverage also converged on the same picture of his final days, still active, still joking, still carrying the old image of strength almost to the very end. That is what makes the ending feel so haunting, because there was no dramatic unraveling, no public confession, no final reinvention, just a quiet disappearance from the center of the story he had once dominated. And in that silence, something became impossible to ignore. Chuck Norris had already outlived the version of himself most people were still clinging to. The action star had become an elder. The fighter had become a symbol. The symbol had become a myth. And the myth had become so large that it almost swallowed the man whole. For years, people talked about Chuck Norris as if he belonged to culture more than to his own family. They repeated the jokes, shared the clips, quoted the legends, and treated his toughness like a permanent law of nature. But in the end, he belonged where every human being belongs, with the people who loved him before the headlines, after the applause, and beyond the public performance. That is where legends return when the world is finished using them. They return home. And maybe that is the part of the Chuck Norris story that matters most now. Not the meme, not the impossible punchlines, not even the fortune. Yes, the public conversation quickly moved to his estimated $70 a million net worth, a number tied to decades of film, television, endorsements, and business ventures. But even that figure tells you less about his life than people think. It measures accumulation. It does not measure burden. It does not measure the cost of becoming a permanent emblem of strength. It does not measure what it feels like to age inside a body the public has turned into folklore. Because the real legacy of Chuck Norris is not money. It is not even fame. It is endurance as identity. He came from instability and built order. He came from uncertainty and built control. He came from ordinary human weakness and built an image so powerful that generations of strangers mistook it for invincibility. Very few public figures ever achieve that kind of permanence. Even fewer survive it with their dignity intact. Chuck Norris did. That is why his death feels bigger than the loss of an actor from another era. It feels like the end of a certain American idea, the idea that toughness can be clean, moral, silent, and absolute. The idea that a man can stand firm while the culture changes around him. The idea that strength, if carried long enough, might somehow become immunity. But no one is immune. And that is not what diminishes him. That is what completes him. Because once you remove the exaggeration, once you strip away the jokes and the heroic lighting and the mythology of indestructibility, what remains is far more powerful than the meme ever was. A man who built himself, a man who endured, a man who became larger than life, and then, at the end, revealed life again. That is why people will keep talking about Chuck Norris. Not only because he kicked down doors on screen, not only because he became an internet legend, not only because his name turned into shorthand for impossible strength, but because his story exposes something painfully true about all legends. The world loves to worship strength. It loves to laugh at mortality. It loves to believe that certain icons stand outside the rules. And then one day, reality arrives quietly, without permission, and reminds everyone that every myth was once a breathing person. That is the real ending of Chuck Norris. Not a punchline, not a rumor, not a brand. A life, a long one, a disciplined one, a legendary one, and finally, a human one. So no, Chuck Norris did not defeat death. He did something stranger. He made the world forget, for a very long time, that death was ever allowed to come for him at all. And perhaps that is the closest thing to immortality any legend ever gets. But even after the tributes fade, the clips slow down, and the headlines move on, Chuck Norris leaves behind a question that is far bigger than his career. What happens to a man after the world turns him into a permanent symbol? Because symbols do not get to age naturally. They do not get to be complicated. They do not get to be tired. They do not get to disappear quietly without disappointing the people who needed them to stay larger than life forever. That was the hidden burden of Chuck Norris. For millions, he was never just an actor. He was a reassurance, a reminder of a world where right still looked strong, where discipline still mattered, where power could be direct and moral instead of cynical and theatrical. He stood for a version of certainty people were afraid of losing. And when a public figure begins to represent certainty itself, his decline becomes almost unbearable to watch, because it feels personal. It feels as if something larger is collapsing with him. Not just a body, not just a career, but an entire emotional framework people once trusted. That is why Chuck Norris's passing carried a weight that went beyond celebrity grief. It was not only the loss of a familiar face, it was the loss of a kind of cultural anchor. A man whose image had helped define strength for decades was suddenly gone, and the world was left staring at the one thing his legend had delayed so effectively. The silence that follows a giant when he is no longer there to fill the frame. And yet, maybe that silence tells the truth more clearly than the myth ever did. Because when all the exaggeration is removed, Chuck Norris's life does not look like a superhero story. It looks like a story of construction. A man constructing himself through discipline, constructing identity through pain, constructing permanence through consistency, constructing an image so durable that even people who never watched his work believed they already knew him. That kind of life is not accidental. It is built with repetition, with refusal, with restraint, with the willingness to become the same man over and over again until the world accepts that image as fact. And Chuck Norris understood that better than most. He understood that the public does not always love complexity. It loves clarity. It loves a figure it can recognize instantly. He gave people that clarity for decades. He gave them the fighter, the protector, the stoic hero, the disciplined man whose presence alone seemed to restore order. Whether in martial arts, film, television, or cultural mythology, he represented force without chaos. That is a rare image, and once the world attached it to him, it never really let him go. But the price of clarity is compression. The clearer your public image becomes, the less room there is for your private self. And by the end of Chuck Norris's life, that private self had become almost sacred precisely because it had been protected for so long. He did not dissolve into endless confession. He did not hand every fear to the cameras. He did not spend his final years negotiating his mortality in public. That choice preserved something many celebrities lose completely: distance. And inside that distance, there was dignity. Maybe that is why his story still feels so powerful now. Not because everything about him was known, but because so much of him was not. The mystery did not weaken his legacy. It deepened it. It reminded people that the man they thought they understood was always more than the version sold to them, more than the kicks, more than the one-liners, more than the righteous hero riding into yet another story where justice would somehow prevail before the credits rolled. Real life never resolves that neatly. Real life leaves fragments, a family with memories the public will never fully touch, a body of work that will outlive the man who made it, a public image that keeps circulating long after the private voice behind it is gone, and a strange, lingering ache that comes from realizing someone who felt mythic was human all along. That ache is the real afterlife of Chuck Norris, not the meme, not the rumor, not even the legend in its loudest form, but the quiet reevaluation that happens after the myth cracks, when people begin to look back and see not just strength, but effort, not just confidence, but discipline, not just invincibility, but endurance under pressure. That is when the story becomes complete. Because a legend is not truly understood at the peak of power. It is understood at the moment the power can no longer perform for us, and we are forced to ask what was real underneath it. In Chuck Norris's case, what was real turns out to be more compelling than the myth itself. A man who built an image so powerful that culture exaggerated it into immortality, while he quietly continued living the ordinary, difficult truth of being human. And that may be why he will remain unforgettable. Not because he conquered death, not because the internet said he could not be touched, not because Hollywood made him look harder than steel, but because he revealed something almost no icon manages to reveal. That strength is most impressive, not when it avoids mortality, but when it carries itself with discipline all the way toward it. So, in the end, Chuck Norris leaves behind more than films, more than television, more than jokes, more than a fortune, more than a famous name. He leaves behind an image of endurance. And for a world addicted to spectacle, that may be the rarest legacy of all. And maybe that is why Chuck Norris will continue to matter long after the headlines disappear. Because some public figures are remembered for what they said, others for what they destroyed, others for the scandals they left behind. But Chuck Norris will be remembered for something quieter, and in many ways more difficult to achieve. He will be remembered for what he represented, not just toughness, not just masculinity, not just action movie dominance. He represented control in a culture that often rewards chaos. That is a rare kind of power. In every era, the world creates its own heroes. Some are loud, some are reckless, some burn bright and collapse even brighter. But Chuck Norris belonged to a different category entirely. He was not sold as dangerous because he was unpredictable. He was powerful because he was predictable in the best possible way. He would stand firm. He would endure. He would do what was right. He would not flinch. He would not panic. He would not bend himself into whatever shape the culture demanded next. That kind of constancy is almost extinct now. And maybe that is why his legacy feels heavier in retrospect than it did in real time. When he was at his peak, people saw the kicks, the stare, the calm voice, the unmistakable aura of command. But with distance, what stands out even more is the discipline required to maintain that identity for so long. Public life corrodes people. Fame distorts them. Success makes them indulgent. Attention makes them theatrical. Yet Chuck Norris somehow preserved an image of order while living inside industries built on vanity and reinvention. That alone is extraordinary. But it is also what made his final chapter so emotionally charged. Because when a man spends his life representing order, his absence does not feel like ordinary absence. It feels like a structure disappearing, a beam removed from the ceiling, a fixed point vanishing from the room. You do not just notice that he is gone, you notice that something around him no longer holds quite the same way. That is the aftershock of a figure like Chuck Norris. His passing does not simply invite sadness. It invites recalculation. It forces people to look at the era that created him and ask whether anyone like that can exist again. Not in the ironic sense, not as parody, not as a recycled image sold through nostalgia, but as a genuine cultural presence. A man whose identity feels rooted, disciplined, and morally legible enough that millions of strangers project trust onto him. That kind of figure is increasingly hard to find, and perhaps impossible to manufacture. Because Chuck Norris did not become Chuck Norris through branding alone, he became Chuck Norris through repetition, conviction, and a very old-fashioned relationship to discipline. He earned authority before the culture turned him into a punchline. He built credibility before the internet turned him into folklore. And that is why the joke worked in the first place. It exaggerated something people already sensed was there. He felt unshakable. Not because he was supernatural, but because he was so committed to appearing grounded that the world mistook groundedness for invincibility. That misunderstanding became the foundation of his myth. And like all myths, it said as much about the people believing it as it did about the man himself. People needed Chuck Norris to be unbreakable because they were afraid so much else was not. They needed him to stand outside weakness, because the world increasingly seemed built out of weakness, compromise, confusion, and noise. He gave them a fantasy of firmness, a fantasy of competence, a fantasy that somewhere, somehow, there still existed a man who could look at chaos without becoming chaotic himself. That is why he mattered, and that is why his death resonated far beyond his filmography. When a symbol like that disappears, people are not only grieving the individual, they are grieving what the individual helped them believe about the world. In Chuck Norris's case, that belief was simple and powerful. Strength could still be honorable. Strength could still be calm. Strength did not have to scream to be real. That belief outlived his body. And, in some ways, that may be the most meaningful inheritance he leaves behind. Not the money, not the fame, not the internet mythology, but the enduring image of a man who made discipline look dignified. That is not a small thing. In an age obsessed with exposure, he kept part of himself closed. In an age obsessed with spectacle, he made restraint compelling. In an age obsessed with reinvention, he stayed recognizable. And that consistency became its own kind of art. By the end, the public could no longer separate Chuck Norris the man from Chuck Norris the symbol. Maybe that separation had been impossible for years. But death has a way of briefly restoring clarity. It reminds us that every symbol had a heartbeat, every legend had a body, and every myth once had to wake up in the morning and choose how to face the day. Chuck Norris faced that day the same way he seemed to face everything else. With discipline, with privacy, with force held in reserve, with dignity that did not need explanation. That is why the ending lingers. Because it does not feel like the end of a joke. It feels like the end of a presence. A long, disciplined, unmistakable presence that shaped how generations imagined toughness, morality, and masculine control. And now that the presence is gone, What remains is not emptiness, but outline, a silhouette in cultural memory. A standard people will keep referencing even when they no longer fully remember where it came from. That is how legends survive, not by refusing to die, but by becoming a measurement after death. And Chuck Norris has become exactly that. A measurement of endurance, a measurement of discipline, a measurement of how completely one human being can fuse with the image he spent a lifetime creating. So when people speak his name years from now, they may start with the jokes. They may mention the memes, the action scenes, the television iconography, the impossible toughness. But beneath all of that, whether they realize it or not, they will be describing something much more serious. A man who turned self-control into identity, identity into legend, and legend into permanence. And that permanence, however mythologized, is real. Because even now, after the final chapter has closed, Chuck Norris still seems to stand in the imagination the same way he stood on screen for decades. Quiet, steady, unmoved, watching the world change around him, while somehow remaining exactly who he was. That is not immortality, but it is close enough to make people wish it were.